The evening had settled into its usual quiet by the time Ethan Parker stepped into the bathroom. The apartment felt too still, the kind of stillness that followed long days when words had already been spent elsewhere. Daniel had gone to bed early, claiming a headache, and Ethan hadn't pressed him. Lately, pressing felt pointless. They had learned how to move around each other without friction, careful not to disturb what little peace remained. Ethan turned the shower knob and waited for the familiar rush of warmth. Instead, the pipes groaned, coughed, and surrendered to silence. A thin trickle sputtered out and disappeared down the drain. He stood there for a moment, waterless and frustrated, the towel still draped over his shoulder like an afterthought. Perfect, he muttered to himself. The building was old, temperamental in ways management never fully addressed. Ethan leaned against the sink, staring at his reflection. At 34, he looked mostly the same as he had a decade earlier, though the lines near his eyes had deepened, shaped by responsibilities and compromises. His marriage, once full of spontaneous laughter and shared plans, now felt like a careful arrangement that functioned best when neither of them asked too much. He glanced at the clock. It was too late to wait for maintenance, too early to give up on the day entirely. The idea of going to bed unshowered filled him with a strange irritation, as if even that small routine had been taken from him. A thought surfaced reluctantly. The neighbor, Lucas Reed, had moved in 2 months earlier. They had exchanged polite greetings in the hallway, nothing more. Ethan knew he lived alone, worked odd hours, and smiled easily. That was the extent of it. Still, the idea of knocking on someone else's door wrapped in a towel made Ethan hesitate. He stood there longer than necessary, debating with himself. This was harmless, he reasoned. A simple request. Water. Nothing else. Ethan grabbed 2 empty bottles from under the sink, wrapped the towel securely around his waist, and stepped into the hallway. The air outside felt cooler, sharper. He paused outside Lucas's door, raised his hand, and knocked before he could change his mind. The door opened almost immediately. Lucas stood there in a loose t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly damp as if he had just finished his own shower. His expression shifted from mild surprise to concern when he saw Ethan. "Hey," Lucas said. "Everything okay?" Ethan cleared his throat. "Sorry to bother you. My water cut out mid-shower. I was wondering if I could borrow some. Just enough to get by." Lucas glanced at the bottles, then back at Ethan. There was no judgment in his eyes, no awkward pause. Just an easy nod. "Yeah, of course. Come in. Or, wait here, I'll fill those up." Ethan stayed in the doorway, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt. Not physically, exactly, but emotionally, as if asking for help had stripped something away. Lucas returned with the bottles filled, handing them over carefully. "Old pipes," Lucas said. "Happened to me last week." Ethan let out a small laugh, relieved. "So it's not just me." "Definitely not." For a moment, neither of them moved. The hallway light hummed softly overhead. Ethan noticed details he hadn't before, the calm steadiness in Lucas's posture, the way his voice carried warmth without effort. "Thanks," Ethan said. "I'm Ethan, by the way. I don't think we've actually introduced ourselves." "Lucas," he replied. "Nice to officially meet you." Their hands brushed briefly as Lucas adjusted his grip on one of the bottles. It was accidental, insignificant, and yet Ethan felt it linger longer than it should have. He stepped back slightly, unsettled by his own awareness. "Well, I won't keep you," Ethan said quickly. Lucas hesitated. "If the water doesn't come back on tonight, just knock again." "Seriously." The offer was casual, but something in his tone suggested sincerity rather than politeness. Ethan nodded, unsure why the simple kindness affected him so strongly. Back inside his apartment, Ethan poured the water carefully, finishing his shower with deliberate slowness. The water was cold, but his thoughts were warm and restless. He replayed the interaction in fragments, Lucas's smile, his calm voice, the absence of awkwardness. When he finally joined Daniel in the bedroom, Daniel was already asleep, turned slightly away. Ethan lay beside him, staring at the ceiling. He felt an unexpected guilt, sharp and misplaced. Nothing had happened. Nothing had even come close, and yet, something had shifted. The next morning, the water was back as if nothing had gone wrong. Life resumed its predictable rhythm. Ethan dressed for work, exchanged brief words with Daniel about schedules and errands. The conversation felt thin, stretched tight over an unspoken distance. As Ethan left the apartment, Lucas stepped out of his own door at the same time. Their eyes met, and Lucas smiled, easy and familiar now. Water situation fixed? Lucas asked. Yeah, Ethan said. Guess it just needed the night. Good, Lucas replied. See you around, Ethan. Yeah, Ethan said again, softer this time. They walked in opposite directions, but Ethan felt the weight of the encounter settle into him. It wasn't desire, not exactly. It was recognition. A sense of being seen in a way he hadn't realized he'd been missing. All day, Ethan caught himself thinking about small things, the way Lucas hadn't made him feel foolish, the quiet respect in his voice. He scolded himself for it, reminded himself of vows and shared history. Daniel deserved better than wandering thoughts. That evening, as Ethan stood once more in the bathroom, the sound of running water filling the space, he realized the problem hadn't been the pipes at all. It was the silence he had been living with, and the way one simple knock had broken it. That he turned off the shower and listened to the apartment around him, wondering how easily comfort could turn into something more, and whether he was strong enough to stop it before it did. The days that followed were ordinary in ways that felt rehearsed. I went to work, answered emails, and nodded through conversations, but a thin layer of awareness clung to everything I did. Lucas Reed hadn't done anything wrong by leaving that morning, yet his absence pressed on me more than his presence had. I told myself that was natural, that shared space always leaves an echo, but the explanation sounded hollow even as I repeated it. Noah Carter called that evening, his voice tired but affectionate. He apologized for being distant, for missed dinners and delayed replies, and I assured him it was fine. The words came easily, too easily, and that unsettled me. As we talked, I noticed myself measuring his tone against Lucas's quiet attentiveness, a comparison I hadn't intended to make. When we hung up, I stared at my phone, disappointed in a way I couldn't justify. Lucas texted the next morning. It was brief, casual, a simple thanks again for the place to stay. I responded just as casually, matching his restraint. That should have been the end of it, a polite closing of a moment that didn't need revisiting. Instead, the conversation stretched, one harmless message leading to another. We talked about work, about nothing, about everything that didn't require vulnerability, until it did. That he asked how I was really doing. The question landed heavier than it should have. I typed, erased, and typed again before answering honestly. I admitted I felt unsettled, disconnected, unsure why. Lucas didn't rush to reassure me or redirect the conversation. He listened, even through text, offering understanding instead of solutions. That patience drew me in, and I felt a quiet relief I hadn't realized I was seeking. Over the next week, Lucas became a constant presence in my thoughts. We didn't see each other often, but his messages threaded through my days, small check-ins that felt intimate without being intrusive. I started to anticipate them, to feel a lift in my mood when his name appeared on my screen. When Noah texted, I responded with care, but the excitement wasn't the same, and that difference gnawed at me. That I told myself I was allowed to have friends, allowed to feel supported. The justifications stacked neatly, each one reasonable on its own. There was no secrecy, I argued, no explicit boundary crossed. Yet I found myself angling my phone away when Noah sat beside me, not because I was hiding something tangible, but because I didn't want to explain the comfort I was drawing from someone else. Lucas noticed the shift before I did. One afternoon, he asked if he was overstepping, if our conversations felt like too much. The question should have been my cue to pull back, to restore the balance I'd let tilt. Instead, I assured him he wasn't, that I appreciated having someone who understood. Saying it aloud, even through text, made it feel true, and that frightened me. The distance between Noah and me widened in subtle ways. Our conversations grew polite, careful, as if we were both avoiding a topic neither of us could name. He sensed the change, I was sure of it, but he trusted me enough not to accuse. That trust weighed on me, a quiet reminder of what I stood to lose. Each time I chose not to mention Lucas, that weight grew heavier. The turning point came on an unremarkable evening. Lucas and I met for coffee after work, a public space that felt safe, neutral. We talked easily, the familiarity between us undeniable. At one point, he fell silent, studying his cup as if it held an answer he was afraid to read. "I don't want to complicate your life," he said finally. "But I need to be honest about how this feels to me." My chest tightened. I knew what he was saying before he said it, and I hated myself for not stopping him sooner. He didn't declare anything dramatic, didn't ask for promises or confessions. He simply acknowledged the closeness, the way it had shifted from comfort to something charged with possibility. Hearing it named stripped away my defenses that I told him about Noah, about my confusion, about the line I hadn't meant to approach. Lucas listened, as he always did, and when he spoke, his words were careful. He didn't ask me to choose, didn't frame the situation as a competition. He said he valued me too much to be a secret or a substitute, and that if we continued, it had to be with clarity. That I went home with his words echoing in my mind. Noah was there, waiting with dinner already prepared, a small gesture that felt monumental in its timing. We ate together, exchanging updates that skimmed the surface of our lives. I watched him across the table, noticing the familiarity of his expressions, the ease we built over time. The contrast between that history and the intensity of my recent feelings left me unsettled. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, replaying conversations, examining intentions I'd ignored. I understood then that infidelity wasn't always marked by a single, undeniable act. Sometimes it grew quietly, nurtured by attention and emotional refuge, until it reshaped loyalties without asking permission. I hadn't touched Lucas, hadn't broken a rule I could point to, yet I'd shifted something essential inside myself. That in the morning, I sent Lucas a message, asking for space while I figured things out. He replied with understanding, though the distance in his words was immediate and palpable. I turned my phone face down and sat with the silence, knowing it was necessary even if it hurt. Later that day, Noah reached for my hand as we walked together, a simple gesture that carried years of shared trust. I held on, aware of the choice forming before me, one that couldn't be postponed without consequence. I didn't know yet how honest I would be, or what honesty would cost, but I recognized the moment for what it was. The bed we'd shared had been innocent enough, but it was the space I'd allowed afterward that mattered. As I stood there, caught between comfort and integrity, I understood that what changed wasn't just my relationships, but my understanding of myself. And whatever came next would demand more than silence to set it right. The following days felt heavier, as if Ethan were carrying a truth he hadn't spoken aloud. He moved through his routines with deliberate care, choosing his words with Daniel, measuring his silences. Nothing outwardly changed, yet everything felt different. Awareness had settled in, and it refused to be ignored. Daniel tried in small ways. He suggested cooking dinner together, asked about Ethan's work with a gentleness that felt like an offering. Ethan responded, grateful and ashamed in equal measure. He wanted to give his full attention, to return to the intimacy that once came naturally, but his thoughts betrayed him. They drifted when he least expected, pulled toward the quiet understanding he had felt outside his marriage. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, Daniel finally spoke the question that had been hovering between them. "Is there someone else?" Daniel asked, not accusing, just searching. Ethan froze, the dish towel clenched in his hands. His mind raced through possibilities: denial, deflection, confession. None felt safe. None felt honest enough. "No," Ethan said after a pause. The word was technically true, and that made it hurt more. Daniel studied his face, looking for cracks. "Then what is it?" Ethan swallowed. "I think I forgot how to talk about what I'm missing." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing that. "I wish you told me sooner." "So do I," Ethan replied. The conversation didn't resolve anything, but it shifted something between them. There was less distance now, replaced by a fragile honesty that felt both relieving and terrifying. That night, they slept closer than they had in weeks, though Ethan lay awake longer than Daniel, his thoughts restless. The next afternoon, Ethan encountered Lucas again. This time, there was no coincidence to blame. Lucas was sitting on the front steps of the building, headphones resting around his neck, watching the street as if waiting for nothing in particular. "Hey," Lucas said, standing as Ethan approached. "Hey," Ethan replied. They stood there, the space between them charged with everything neither had said. Ethan noticed the restraint in Lucas's posture, the careful way he didn't step closer. "I've been meaning to say," Lucas began, then stopped, reconsidering. "I don't want to make things complicated for you." Ethan's chest tightened. "They already are." Lucas met his gaze steadily. "Then maybe we should keep things simple." The suggestion carried weight. Simplicity meant distance. It meant letting go of something that had never fully formed but had already taken root. "I think that's for the best," Ethan said, forcing the words past the lump in his throat. Lucas nodded, accepting the boundary without protest. "I'm glad we talked." "So am I," Ethan replied, surprised to realize it was true. They parted without lingering, without promises. As Ethan walked away, he felt both loss and relief. The temptation hadn't vanished, but it had been named, and that gave him a measure of control. At home, Ethan found Daniel in the living room, flipping through a book he wasn't really reading. Ethan sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I ran into Lucas today," Ethan said, choosing honesty while it still felt possible. Daniel looked at him, attentive but calm. And I realized I don't want to lose us because I didn't know how to speak up." Daniel exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he'd been holding. "Neither do I." They didn't solve everything that evening. There were no declarations, no sudden return to what they had been. But there was intention, and that felt like a beginning rather than an ending. Later, standing alone in the bathroom, Ethan let the shower run and listened to the steady sound of water. He thought about how easily things could have gone differently, how a moment of vulnerability could have led him somewhere he wasn't prepared to go. He recognized now that infidelity didn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived quietly, disguised as understanding. When Ethan turned off the water and stepped out, he felt steadier than he had in weeks. Not certain, not resolved, but aware. He dried his hands, glanced at his reflection, and allowed himself a small, tired smile. Life would continue, complicated and imperfect. Temptation would not disappear simply because it had been resisted once. But Ethan knew now where the line was, and that knowledge mattered. As he left the bathroom and joined Daniel in the quiet of their shared space, Ethan understood that the story wasn't finished. It was still unfolding, shaped by choices made in moments that seemed small, but never truly were.